Hey, I'm Sid, and today I'm going to be talking about building modern websites with WordPress and GraphQL. So, a little bit about me. I live in Mumbai, in India. I work at Gatsby Inc. I help maintain Gatsby open source. I also helped build incremental builds on Gatsby Cloud. Currently, I'm working on Gatsby Functions, which is a serverless implementation built into Gatsby. It's coming soon. I'm also writing a book called Web Development for Everyone. You can check it out at webdevelopmentforeveryone.com. Besides that, more stuff about me, but fun stuff now. I like diving, especially in wrecks and with sharks. I'm also learning how to fly a plane this year on weekends. And I'm also trying to buy a PS5. If you know where it's in stock, tell me, please. So now let's talk about the Jamstack, because that's what I get paid to talk about. If you like the Jamstack like me, you're probably building sites using Gatsby or Next or Hugo or 11T. And when you build these static sites, you're likely going to pull data from multiple different data sources, right? One of which could be a CMS. Now, there's a lot of great CMSs to pick from. These include Contentful, Sanity, Tato CMS. But turns out WordPress is still really popular. WordPress still powers about 30% of all websites on the web in 2020. And WordPress is a great CMS. I mean, it's got a familiar writing experience. People have been using it for years now, so they're really comfortable with how it works. It's got a wealth of plugins to do really anything you want to do with it, including stuff like advanced custom fields, WooCommerce for e-commerce, and so on. WordPress also happens to be open source, and that's great because that means there's no limit on, you can build it anywhere and run it anywhere. You're not, tied into a specific platform. And typically with a lot of CMSs, we see that users, the number of users you can have on a space is typically limited, and that ends up being a bottleneck, especially when it comes to pricing. With WordPress, this isn't the case. So WordPress is still super flexible, and it's a great CMS to use. But if you're building a site in today's day and age, you're probably using a JavaScript framework. You could be using React, Vue, Svelte, really anything you like. But when you build your site using one of these frameworks, you're typically going to consume your WordPress CMS instance using its REST API. And the moment REST APIs get into the picture, we're back to seeing those familiar issues, right? Stuff like overfetching, stuff like underfetching. And it turns out that rendering a simple post then becomes a matter of more than 1, 2, or even 5 network requests. Let's look at a concrete example of what this looks like. This is a site that I built up. This is a mock-up, and it's called the Good News Times because we could all use some of that. And this resembles a lot of popular news sites. And as you can see, there's a bunch of cards. Each card is an article. It has an image, it has a title, some text. It also has an author and an author image, right? And we have 4 articles on this homepage. Now, to render this page, which again, like I said, has posts and authors, you'll need to make 9 API calls to WordPress if you happen to use the REST API. And I've listed all of these API calls, and you'll see that there's one to get all the posts themselves, and then there's one for each author and one for each featured image. That sums up to 9 API calls for just 4 posts, and that's a lot, right? Now, in the past, we've used GraphQL to wrap REST APIs. And when you do that on the client, that kind of, helps simplify your code base. But stuff is still slow because you're still making 9 API calls. And that's a lot of data over the wire, right? And it's also brittle because if you happen to, have code that maybe one of those API calls fails in, you're still going to have to sort of handle that for each and every one of them and make sure you gracefully take care of all those error cases. And also, needless to say, this doesn't scale really well. We're looking at a lot of API requests for a single page load. And the moment, we talk at scale, this stuff adds up. So let's try to move this over to GraphQL, right? That's what this talk is all about. It's about building modern websites on WordPress with GraphQL. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to use WPGraphQL. If you haven't seen WPGraphQL before, it's a plugin for WordPress. It happens to give you a one-click GraphQL API right out of the box. You just install it. It doesn't need any settings to start with, and you get a GraphQL API. It also happens to have plugins for really, popular stuff on WordPress, like WooCommerce and advanced custom fields. I've already gone over and set up a WordPress site, and the WordPress site here, as you can see, is running locally on my machine. It's called Good News Site. And I've also gone ahead and installed the plugin, as you can see in our plugins page, which is opening. There you go. You see that we already have WP GraphQL installed. So let's take a look at what that gives us. The first thing we see is this really nice graphical IDE button. Let's click on that. And there you go. We see our familiar graphical IDE. And this is great because this is going to help us write a query. So let's go back to our code and take a look at what we'll need to do to move it over to GraphQL, right? We have this sample project here. What this project does is that it, as we saw before, renders a bunch of cards. Each of these cards are rendered from some articles, and those articles are fetched in this custom React hook, which does a bunch of those API calls, as you can see, right? And then it transforms them into a shape that our card component requires, and then our card component goes ahead and renders that. Right now, this works just fine. It's running on localhost 8000, and you can see that it makes those requests and renders these cards. Let's go ahead, but before we go ahead, we can still see that there are a bunch of those API calls, right? You see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Supposed to be 9, but I see 8 right now. Maybe I'm counting wrong. Oh, there you go. There's the 9th one. So these are all the API calls it's making. That's a lot. We've spoken about that. Let's go and let's go and make this work with GraphQL, shall we? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take a look at all the data we need, right? We need title, description, slug, image URL, the author name, and the avatar URL. Let's go ahead and write our GraphQL query. To do that, you'll see that I've already written out because I, practiced this a while ago, but I'm going to delete that, and let's write this GraphQL API. Let's write this GraphQL query from scratch. So the first thing we're going to need is posts. We want all of them. We only have 4 posts right now. Otherwise, we could add a filter, but let's ignore that for now. For each post, we want the title, we want the content, we want the author, which happens to have a node, which will have the author's name. We also want their avatar, which I think has a node as well. Oh, no, it doesn't. It just has a URL. That's great. So now we have everything about the post and the author, but we also need the featured image. And I think that's called, there you go. It's called featured image. How convenient. And that has a node with a URI, also has a source URL. So let's use that. We'll also probably need the slug, because that'll help us have some kind of key for each post. So let's go ahead and get that slug as well. I'm going to run this query, and as you see, I get all the data, and that's great. It just works. So let's keep this query here. Let's go back, set up some GraphQL for our project. So I think what we want to do in this case is let's get rid of all of this. I love deleting code, right? So let's delete all of that. And now that that's gone, let's go ahead and import. Let's go ahead and import use query from Urkel. I love Urkel. I think Carrie is talking about Urkel today or maybe yesterday. But anyway, let's write a query. So what we're going to do is we're going to get result from use query, and when we call it, I think this takes, there you go, takes an object which has a query, and that can be a string. And I'm going to go ahead and copy this, paste it right here. And before this just works, we're going to want to wrap our layout components. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's import, I think it's called create client, and provider from Urkel, and let's go ahead and create a client. So I think what that needs is a URL. There you go. And our URL in this case is going to be our site / GraphQL, like we're used to seeing. So let's go ahead and set that. And we're also going to set prefer get method to true. I think Oracle uses post by default. WPGraphQL prefers get. So just let's stick to get for now. So we have a client. We're going to go ahead and wrap. I just realized that this probably should have been an index. So let's go ahead and move this over to our index and then wrap the layout instead of putting it in layout, right? So I'm just gonna, there you go. That should be fine. And now let's wrap our provider in here. We're gonna set a value to the client, I think that's all we should need. So we have our provider in place. We have our article component that, goes ahead and calls this query. Let's go ahead and destructure our data and fetching from our result in Oracle. And finally, why is this complaining? Because, I'm still inside the function. There you go. So let's go ahead and put that there. Let's log data. Let's also go ahead and say that if fetching is true, we probably want to return null, right? Let's take a look at our logs and see if that works and what that does. So we see, interesting, did that not save? All right, there's an error and it refuses to compile because articles is no longer, there you go, articles doesn't exist. So I'm gonna comment this out and hit refresh, and we see that we have data now. Besides all the other errors, we do have data with posts and notes. So we have our data. Let's now go ahead and write everything we need to make it render. So I'm gonna go ahead and I think we'll need to transform our data a tad because the data format that we have from WP GraphQL is going to be slightly different than what we had from the REST API. So let's go ahead and map these, and let's say each of them is a post, and we're going to return a certain object. All right, and we know that we want stuff for our cards, so let's go ahead and copy those keys in here. Let's say this is name and this is avatar URL. We should be able to set these fairly quickly. Title is post.title, as we know because we wrote the query. Description is going to be post.content. Slug can just be post.slug. Image URL, I reckon, is post. There you go. Featured image dot node dot source URL. Finally, author is going to be post dot author dot node dot name, and avatar URL is going to be post. I cannot spell today. Anywho, so this is going to be post dot author dot node dot avatar dot URL. Right, I think this should just work. So let's go ahead and, all right, we have no errors. Let's go ahead and take a look at our client. We're gonna hit refresh, and there you go, it just works. We have the entire page rendering, all our cards look good, it has all the data we were looking for. So we just took a JavaScript, like a site built with React, or really you could use any JavaScript framework, but we just took some JavaScript code that called a bunch of these REST APIs and swapped it over to use GraphQL with WP GraphQL all within a few minutes, right? And it was that easy. So yeah, let's talk about some quick comparisons. Our REST API needed about 9 requests to render that one page. WP GraphQL with GraphQL, we needed to make 1 network request in total. The JSON API eventually took about roughly a second and, a little more than a second. WP GraphQL took less than a third of that, right? And that's great, because if you look at the amount of data as well, and this was all running locally, but of course these numbers can grow dramatically when you're running this, like when this stuff happens over the network. For the JSON API, it downloaded 13.7 KB, whereas for our GraphQL request, it downloaded 1.6 KB, right? And I ran some load tests. I was able to hit the REST API for about roughly hundreds of requests in a second, whereas the GraphQL API, I was able to hit about 1,000 per second. That's roughly a 10x. Well, not roughly, that is a 10x difference. So yeah, that's what WP GraphQL is. It's a great way to get GraphQL working in your WordPress project. And WP GraphQL is a Gatsby sponsored project. It works out of the box with Apollo, Oracle, really any stack you'd like. It has plugins for all the common WordPress stuff. It's also used in production by QZ.com and ApolloGraphQL.com and Denver Post and many more. So it's been around for a while. It's been used in production at scale for a while. It also hit 1.0 recently, and that's a big deal because this marks its first stable release. My slides have a link to the release notes for the 1.0 release, as well as the blog post that Jason wrote. And with that, that's WP GraphQL. It works out of the box, like I said, with stuff that uses runtime GraphQL, like Apollo or Oracle, or if you'd like to use GraphQL at build time like Gatsby does, that also works out of the box with WP GraphQL. And really, like I said before, it should work with any stack. It's just an API. This truly makes WordPress a headless CMS. And yeah, that's my talk. I'd like to thank Jason, who's built WP GraphQL over the years. And this is a funny picture of him posing as the Tiger King. There's also his Twitter on this slide. Go ahead and follow him. He's fantastic. Tyler, who also is another co-worker of mine, has been building Gatsby source WordPress. So if you like Gatsby and you'd like to use WP GraphQL with Gatsby site, Gatsby source WordPress, its new version that Tyler has been building, works right out of the box. It's a lot faster than the previous versions that use the REST API. You can follow him on Twitter. He also happens to be the nicest Canadian guy I know, and that's a lot, right? That's saying a lot, because Canadian people are nice. And yeah, I hope WP GraphQL makes you as happy as Peppa Pig makes my niece. Thank you.